Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for having me here. Um, Glad to be representing the third pole, but also to be among people who are taking climate change so seriously, and especially the nexus, जैसे आपने कहा, between academia and climate journalism. So this is amazing.
Excuse me for interrupting, but the mic is muted, so we cannot hear you, we who are not there.
Okay. Can you hear now? Am I audible now?
Dr. Elizabeth, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can, and I'm sure also Una and Dr. Mufis can hear us.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth, for that warm note of welcome. And I'm glad to be here among people who are so interested in climate change, and particularly taking it to the forum of journalism and journalists. The basic thing is, before selling it to anybody else, and why your program is important, is are even journalists ready to understand that climate change is an important beat in itself? Because a lot of times, how it has been sold to journalists earlier is this is fluff. And you know, fluff एक terminology hai, and a lot of women journalists, female journalists, when we had to venture into journalism, we were told that you should basically be handling fluff, which is easier topics, which is things that are easygoing. So you don't get into politics, investigatives, business journalism. But a lot of what we are discovering is climate journalism is actually related to all of these. And that is why it is the next big things, apart from the fact that the world is suffering drastically. Official numbers tell us that about 2,000 Pakistanis lost their lives in the floods this time. But what about the earlier droughts? What about the food insecurity? What about the effect on the economy that we are going to be suffering? So I'm not going to go into all of that because that's already online. But let's take a look at why this is important. Hanji. Is this working? Okay. Okay. So, how climate change overlaps with other beats of journalism? And for starters, let's look at economy and business because that's the hot topic world over, but mainly for Pakistan these days. Energy is there. Transboundary issues are there, and that is why business journalism is very much related to climate journalism. I mean, the billions of dollars worth loss that we have suffered in the floods this time, it will take Pakistan decades actually to get over it. We are not seeing a lot of follow-up journalism, but it is related to business. So, for example, stories like a chief executive of Pakistan going to another country for a gas pipeline, that's climate journalism because it affects energy. Energy is related to emissions, which means it is a business prospect. If we don't have enough water, if we cannot produce enough in our industry, then that's related to journalism. So all business journalists, and this is how at the level of academics, we have to sell it to our students. Because a big challenge we are seeing nowadays is not enough students want to just take up climate journalism or environmental issues as their prime beat. So they want to be doing a lot of things, but they don't want to specify. And somebody mentioned science. Unless you really know what you're going to be writing about, and that's your specialty, and we have amazing journalists who write about or talk about business and profit and loss, but they don't know enough about, say, adaptation or mitigation or जो भी jargon हम इस्तेमाल करते हैं उसके बारे में उनको इतना पता नहीं होता. Investigative journalism is important. So recently we did something on the third pole, and it was a deep investigative about the reclaimed land in Karachi. And what can happen, say there is, God forbids, a tsunami. जो लोग कराची से वाकिफ़ हैं उन्हें पता है कि वहाँ पे कहा जाता है कि एक श्राइन है जिसकी वजह से कराची tsunamis में बच जाता है, बारिशों में बच जाता है, but that's not the case and we all know. So that. Then mainly human-centric, which I will come to in a bit, and gender. There is biodiversity, there is animal life, there is marine life, which affects fisheries. Livelihoods of millions are dependent in our region on that. There is, of course, water. So if the Kabul River is, say it's, sewage is going into it, and then that is flowing to Afghanistan or vice versa. किस तरह से उसको देखा जाएगा? Irrigation is related to it. Then there are transboundary issues. Cultural stories. Abhi, we are working on a story on how Sindh's ajraks were previously made by organic dyes and now they are made by chemical dyes, and how that is affecting the environment. So great cultural stories. But very importantly, and I wish I had made it bigger, politics. It's a geopolitical and political economy issue, climate change. And we are seeing that. It's coming in the headlines constantly. Our foreign minister is currently in the process of traveling to USA for the G77. China is involved. But all of this has to be told to the students, and that is why it's important for them to know that this is why climate journalism is important. So Dr. Elizabeth really wanted and had suggested very rightly that we take up a few examples of how human-centric stories are involved, because we spoke about storytelling and we are storytellers at the end. और जब हम कहानियाँ सुनाते हैं तो उसमें इंसान आ जाता है. So not just sob stories or sad stories, but also good stories. We recently did a story, a follow-up story, me and Zofin Ibrahim, on the effects of dengue in waterlogged Pakistan after the floods. So it's a follow-up story. Dengue is still there in those areas. It might have ended in the bigger cities or it might be on its way out. The water's still standing. 25% of Pakistan is still underwater. What about the waterborne diseases over there? So it's a health story in that sense. This was a feel-good story. The second one, women came up with a way to save lives through solar power in Sindh. And then there's a very interesting story over here from Bangladesh, and that is about the Nakshi Kanta embroidery and how that is evolving with changing climate and tastes. So how they're even using climate change in their embroidery. And lastly, there was a story from Balochistan about how coal dust is affecting children's health in Pakistan. Now, there's so many stories. Imagine, I think they're saying about 3,000 or 30,000 houses have been lost, but we know the numbers are much higher. All of them are stories. Can our students tell those stories? This was one of the stories that I had done a long time ago, but it was interesting even now. So there's this entire village in Tharparkar in Sindh, which has people who at any age cannot walk straight. देख के आप यकीन कर सकते हैं that everybody over there is crawling because the arsenic content in the water is so high. That's a story that needs to be told. Editors need to be sensitized also. We would sensitize students, but it would be great if editors at the head of the desks are included in it, because they are the ones who have to place the stories. This story was noticed because it was put on the front page by a journalist and an editor who understood how important this story was. And then, of course, a lot of help went over there. Nonetheless, it's still a huge story. Why it's the next big thing, particularly in the context of Pakistan, I mean, we know why, but just a few pointers. It's a great headline. And as we say in journalism, bad news is very good news. So it's sadly bad news. Climate change is affecting Pakistan much more than many other countries in the region. Environmental journalism overlaps with other major forms of journalism, as we discussed. It's important that we have the terminology included in the curriculum because a lot of people don't know the terminology. For example, when journalism started, we didn't know how to talk about sexual violence or violence against women in Urdu. We currently don't have any glossaries. We don't have the words. तो हम ज़्यादा बोलते मौसमियाती तब्दीली हम घुमा के. And the third pole has an entire section and all Pakistan stories are translated in Urdu. And that's why I know how difficult it is because कुछ चीज़ों के लिए उर्दू में अल्फाज ही नहीं. We don't have words in Urdu. Leave alone vernacular languages or local languages. We don't have that. So we need that, and that's why it's important more people come into it and do this work. And that's why it's open to misunderstanding. So a lot of people still don't take it seriously because there are not enough words for it. Very importantly, as Dr. Altafullah had said, where do you get the data? Where do you get the numbers? One of the biggest challenges we have is that our journalists are great. They'll do a lot of groundwork. They'll go into the field. They'll be happy to do that. However, they don't know how to get the numbers. And how do you get the numbers in a country like Pakistan where we don't even know the exact population realistically? But data has to be produced. And for foreign publications and for our message to go abroad into the international audience, it's important that we know exactly the numbers or at least a semblance of it. So that way, working in consortium also with the governments and the concerned departments and the not-for-profits who are working on field in case of a disaster, what are the actual numbers? How many women suffered? You must have seen that story UNFPA had released initially in the floods, which was a huge number of pregnant women who were affected by floods. Now, that was a story that was a punch in the gut. So we need data to be able to sell our stories, and for that we need trained journalists who are able to create data, evaluate the efficacy and the accuracy of the data, and pass it forward. Also, the range of roles are shifting. So, in the age of new media, it's sometimes difficult to. साफ बात ये है कि पाकिस्तानी जर्नलिस्ट को पैसा तो ज़्यादा मिलता नहीं है. So, a lot of them venture into fields like communication. Now, how to go from gatekeepers to curators of information, and then how to ethically pass that information on. So all of that means the work that you are doing right now is extremely important. It's groundbreaking, really. Why do they need to take it up? Well, a lot of them don't even know the basics, like pitching a story. Believe me, we get pitches, and we get a lot of pitches because it's a foreign publication house, and so the payment is in dollars. So that is an attraction. However, basic things like how to pitch a story. Some of our most brilliant journalists don't know how to get a story across to us. Stories are around them, but they don't somehow connect they can't join the dots that ये एक climate change की story है. उन्हें लगता है ये एक general story है, but those are actually climate change stories. they don't know how to write for international audiences. So if they want to make this a career which is lucrative, then they have to know how to sell it to an audience. They also need to know how to sell it to their editor, how to make it a story which the editor will take on the front page, or at least the second page, or at least on the business page. News media is it's bringing climate change into the narrative. But if journalists are not trained, how will this go forward? Providing an option to students of media to take up climate change journalism as a specialty at both graduate and postgraduate levels, not just an introduction and a touch and go, but more than that. And lastly, to support future newsroom leaders in identifying and addressing the range of issues that can be covered under climate change. Also, basic things like not making it overly dramatic, सिर्फ उदास कहानियाँ नहीं बल्कि सक्सेस स्टोरीज भी देना, ये सब आप लोग ऑलरेडी कर रहे हैं. करना बस ये है कि उस नक्शे में मौसमियाती तब्दीली को लेके आना है. क्लाइमेट चेंज हैज़ टू बी ब्रॉट टू द सेंटर ऑफ दैट मैप. Why do journalists still not accept climate change as a beat? Again, do they understand that this overlaps? How many of these reasons are myth or fact? What can be done to help more journalists come towards the beat? That's something we need to tell them. Sadly, a lot, even if there are environmental journalists, there are very few females, because this is sometimes for this journalism we have to venture into rough terrain. Investigatives ruffle a lot of feathers, so those things are there as well. So small things like when pitches come to us, we have to see if it's original. Does it have enough sources? Do we understand that the sources, the kind of sources a climate story needs? So it's not enough to just go into a village or a flood camp and just talk to people. What are the kind of sources that one needs? Analyzing the audiences. Also, for example, Third Pole doesn't do just newsy stories. We don't just break the news. It's value additions. How do we come up with value addition stories in climate journalism? And well, this is just about pitching and how we just shoot down so many pitches, sadly, because they are actually not well deliberated. So climate journalism basically is something that doesn't know borders. It goes across the borders. It's across economic strata. We know the effects of climate are across the strata. Everybody is getting affected by it. This time I'm in Lahore. It's not cold at all. So these are very, very basic things. They affect our lives. The smog issue is there in Lahore, but then it's also in Delhi. So these are huge stories, and they need to be told. Do we do a Q&A? Yes, or? Yes. Okay. So anything or any comments, please?
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was really good. I was thinking about like a decade earlier, we were trying to teach development journalism.
Yes.
And one of the biggest social sector reporting, I remember doing a training in 2006 or 7. Since many journalists didn't know at that time, especially in war-torn areas like KP, Peshawar, because most of the time war sells, blood sells. So the issue of subjectivity, it comes to the fore most of the time. Many journalists say like peace journalism, they say it's subjective. Yeah. And there are many questions about that. Although we know that every journalism has a subjective issue. One friend of ours says that when you decide to not to cover KKK in the US, you are subjective because you are not giving them a platform. So I just had this question, whether subjectivity, like the myth of subjectivity in climate journalism is an issue.
Thank you so much. With somebody with your knowledge, मैं क्या आंसर करूँगी, लेकिन objectivity is overrated perhaps, and maybe it's a farce. And journalists generally are very opinionated people behind the lines. They have strong opinions. Sadly, we are seeing it in how polarized our media houses are now. It's coming to the fore. And this is one of the criticisms against climate journalism, that is it something that the development sector in the international world has come up with, or is it actually a requirement? Thing is, that is where data comes in, because the numbers of people getting affected through climate change, the emissions, the energy issues, अभी गैस नहीं आ रही तो अभी पानी नहीं आ रहा तो अभी ये है. So that is all screaming out that this actually is something that is required. Now, which things to take up? Well, the watchdogs would have to be academics who train these young minds who will be future journalists to make sure that the story is told with inherent honesty. And secondly, the editors, I cannot stress enough the importance of sensitizing editors. Editors के पास जाके ना वो गोट रुक जाती है, वहाँ पे जाके वहाँ से आगे कहानी छप नहीं रही होती. So how important it is for editors to know which stories are honest, which stories are worth telling, even if nobody else believes in it. A lot of times we can't tell environmental stories because a big organization who is doing some development work which is affecting the climate in that area is giving a lot of advertisements to a Pakistani newspaper. So these are very real things, and I think it would be great if it's part of the curriculum to include it. Secondly, जो आप कह रहे थे कि subjective है या objective है, if it's in the policy and in the policy of a media platform to publish on it, then the journalists have to, and they will eventually. However, the bigger question is objectivity and subjectivity in itself in journalism, and that's more an existential and philosophical question. So I don't think any of us can really answer that. Ji. Ji, Faraz.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. This actually brings another idea to my mind, the debate of subjectivity and objectivity. So I think the biggest question can be how objective can be objective. And if somebody says, I am objective, I think the statement itself is subjective. Just like if somebody says, I am apolitical, the statement itself is political.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think world's leading journalism institutions, I think they are having this debate on objectivity. So the
Yes.
idea
Yes.
objectivity is farce.
Yes,
I
I
agree.
agree.
I think you said it beautifully when you said it's farce.
Yeah.
So, well, we all have our opinions and journalists are opinionated. So, and bringing the idea of subjectivity to climate change, just my question is that, so it's okay, well, is this how we should tell our students that it's okay to be subjective?
So thank you so much for that, Dr. Farasat. We do tell them that it's okay to have your own opinions, because I think, therefore I am. So one is alive because of one's opinions and beliefs and whatever we want to make life worth living. However, we also have to tell them that there is a delicate balance. So for example, if a story doesn't have a 360-degree observation, it's tilting too much towards, say, just one source. It's just tilting towards, say, one political party or one group of activists, and so you're becoming a kind of an activist rather than a journalist. Your job is to relay information. I'll give you an example. Recently, a very good journalist from Punjab pitched a story, and then she gave us the story, and my editor in UK was editing it. And she had used this sentence, the air was thick with fear. And he said, well, that's her opinion and that's her observation. This is not an opinion piece. And we scratched that line. We can say the air is thick with fog or smog because you can kind of quantify it, but we cannot say the air is thick with fear. So that is why journalists और creative लोगों में ये एक कीड़ा होता है और उनका दिल चाहता है इसलिए फिर वो किताबें लिखते हैं. So it's great that we write fiction on the side, but it's important as editors again to make sure that we bring them to a point that the opinions are not making the story. Yes, it's very, very attractive. You can make great headlines. You can use creative writing skills. But for that, there's also, आपने जो mention किया था, there is the opportunity of opinion writing. So opinion
Excuse me.
writing in itself should be taught, and that's where they can say these things because that's a person's opinion. But if it's a journalistic piece, then we have to bring them. It's not so fun, but we have to. We have to.
Excuse me, could I add a point, please?
Yes, please.
Yeah. No, Maxwell Boykoff and his brother, they wrote an article called Balance as Bias quite a few years ago. And with that, they meant that to give equal space to the climate denialists or skeptics who don't believe in the climate science, and on the other hand, the people who take as a point of departure that the climate science, having now been accepted by 99% of all climate scientists, I believe, to treat them equally would be a kind of bias. So objectivity can be interpreted in different ways, but I think the fundamental thing is to seek for truth, actually. And when we did our youth project in Media Climate, we saw that the young people, they said to the politicians and to the world that please trust the science. It's now been overwhelmingly discovered that the climate change is also human-made. And so to say otherwise and to give equal space to those who don't believe that, that is not objectivity. That is a kind of fake balance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really food for thought. So, for example, you talk to water experts, and some of them are pro-hydro, and others are not. Some believe dams hone chahiye, dams should be there, others don't. So once in a while, if their claim is backed by, as Elizabeth said, some science, then we'll put in their opinion as well. However, they have to substantiate that with research and numbers, but mostly the truth has to be out there. And that makes you sometimes unpopular, but that's the requirement of the job.
Thank you, thank you so much, ma'am. We'll take last comment, and then we have Professor Andreas with us for.
Yeah, it's more like
Yes,
a
sir.
comment than a question. I think as far as the climate journalism or environmental journalism is concerned, mostly it is undertaken through advocacy journalism. And advocacy journalism, as we know that, it is already subjective. An advocate journalist is already holding an opinion and he or she tries to advocate his or her opinion on some climate or environmental issues. So as far as the concern about the objectivity in climate journalism is concerned, I think that should be, that should not be taken into consideration. We should focus on advocacy journalism to promote, to highlight the environmental and climate change issues. Thank you very much.
That leaves us with food for thought and discussion, which maybe we can take on. But thank you so much.